Hi. In the earlier parts of this talk, we talked about the start of the East India Company in 1757 with gradual consolidation of the 50 years and leading to dissatisfaction amongst the soldiers, the princes whose estates were forfeited more or less and who lost their estates and kingdoms. And along with the Islamic religious right, led to 1857 rebellion, mutiny, War of Independence, and that led Queen Victoria to finally dissolve the East India Company. And in the next 40 or 50 years, various viceroys were appointed, and they consolidated and expanded further using the Indian soldiers' revenues and with larger assortment of Scottish and Irish officers and English regiments. And with the advancing technology, they succeeded in extending all the way to Afghanistan, to Burma, Nepal, Tibet. So the huge portion of the empire came under British rule. Okay. And moving on to, they were again worried about the Russian Empire's influence, but finally that didn't amount to much. And negotiations in Europe were successful, and that was the end of that. But the Chinese, who claimed suzerainty over Tibet, came out at short end. And at the same time, the capital was moved in the early 20th century from Calcutta to New Delhi, and to impress with the pomp and circumstances, big darbar, or rather the Indian word for a gathering of the princes, was held in Delhi, and with great pomp and circumstances, and with a claim to generate loyalty and to keep the princes on their side and the educated Indians as a reliable second column of the Indians. And at the same time, various famines were again rampant due to rather harsh tax policies, increasing population, and vagaries of monsoon. And so this was the example of the Darbar. And some of the Indians who by that time were realizing they were second-class citizens, had started small but definite protest and a homegrown movement of spinning cloth, because cotton was a big product for India, and from being a net exporter, she became a exporter of raw materials. And so the promises that Queen Victoria had made sounded hollow, and a lot of the educated Indians and obviously some of the princes saw through that, but they were in minority, and the masses were uneducated and were just trying to make two ends meet. And the army, for whatever reasons, remained very loyal, and that tradition has been continued in the Indian subcontinent. And we talked about the famines, and one of the very large famine took place right at the same tail of the Big Darbar, was the famine of 1877, primarily due to failure of monsoon and cash crops and export of the grain that took place. And there was by this time, Darwinism was in vogue in Europe, in the same way there was Irish famine, and the ideology of making people work for the labor, even though they were starving and malnourished, was introduced, and the doctrine of survival of the fittest permeated to some extent through the establishment of the rich and the administrators. And for example, a governor named Temple, claimed that he had the famine under control, but one-fourth of the people were dead. So that's a strange way of saying it was under control. It started, you know, in the south, and again it spread all over the subcontinents. Okay, and even the relatively rich areas of northwest, which had benefited from irrigation, so it covered an area of 670,000 square kilometers. That's 257,000 square miles, and the estimates of death were as much as 58 million people were starving, and millions of people died. And the counts are obviously underestimated. Okay, now at the same time, there was always skirmishes and battles amongst the ferocious Afghan tribes were continuing at the northwest frontier, and with the English tradition of having a jolly good fight and continued. And these were some of the battalions where have left their mementos on the regimental plaques on the northwest frontier. So there was always a bone of contention, but still people had a rather strange fascination for being posted on the frontier. Now, and at the same time, there were some progressive viceroys who were appointed, and a judge named Ripon had proposed something called an Ilbert Bill, which allowed Indian judges who by that time were educated and were appointed to lower level courts. And then this bill was allowed the Indian judges to pass judgment on European or British population, and this was considered a big stain on their racial superiority, and especially the middle-level people who were not administrators and tea planters, who were a law unto themselves. And because they were isolated, they employed a lot of people, and they could get away with literally murder. And this was opposed by the uh, merchant class, so to speak, and by English women. And this was again, and finally, enough agitation amongst the white population and the English language newspapers was severe enough that the viceroy had to be stepped down or called back, as the case may be. Now, at the same time, there were some British nationals who realized that the Indians were educated and they should be taken into more administrative positions, and they formed a more or less like a debating society called Indian National Congress, which was primarily the educated class, mostly from upper class Hindus, Parsis, and a few smattering of Anglo-Indians who were involved. And this started out as a debating body in Bombay, and a few Englishmen were part of it as well. And there were only 72 delegates, and little did they know that in span of about 40 or 50 years, this would become a force to be reckoned with, and become a mass movement, and would be start a new chapter in asking for democratic rule, and and establish a new tradition which was carried on later on in South Africa, as well as by Martin Luther King. So with the arrival of Mahatma Gandhi, the agitation took a different approach compared to other countries, such as Middle East and other places where the British controlled empire, including even the white colonies of Boer, okay, where uh, military wars started. So there was a altogether different approach for petitioning, nonviolent protest, which we'll talk about, and that was the hallmark which changed how the world viewed the subcontinent, and that was well demonstrated in the movie Gandhi. Okay, all right. and so more about it as we go along. And at that time, the Indian National Congress had no intention in asking for full independence. They were primarily interested in obtaining some privileges and being made at least in some way partners to the state and local level administration, and later on asking for dominion status, which was granted to the white colonies of Australia and Canada. Okay, and at the same time, the one person who was a colonial empire spokesman rose at a very young age of 16 after just a relatively small education in Britain. He was appointed as a reporter for English language papers in Lahore, and later on became the voice of the empire. And obviously he was in accordance with the fashion and the thinking of that time was quite racist, and thought that the white man's burden was to civilize these natives, and wrote glowing poems and articles admiring the benefits that the European or the British administration was providing to the natives, and wrote some romantic stories which were lapped up by the home crowd, primarily Kim and Jungle Boy, about and he looked down upon the educated Indians, and at the same time admired the locals, who were the people of the earth, including the Jungle Boy and the simple servants. And they were fond of their Muslim servants, primarily because they had a lot more in common, because they could share meals with them. And so his novels, had a great following, and are still being read in Britain, and became part of the subcontinental literature. Okay, and at that time, the uninteresting piece that even Winston Churchill served as a reporter during the Afghan wars in 1897, and later on worked in South Africa, and obviously being a privileged person, and was a daredevil young person reporter, and took some heavy risk, and was just lucky enough not to be shot and die on the Northwest frontier. The history of the world would have been totally different. Now, even before the arrival of Gandhi, and later on by Nehru, there were other people who were on the forefront of agitation, and they were not quite non-violent. They were not radical to the face of taking up arms, but they strictly boycotted foreign goods and demanded for self-rule as early as 1905. And promptly they were arrested. One was Maharashtrian, another was from North India, and so on. And one was from Bengal. So they represented the whole subcontinent, more or less. And some of them were more moderate. And so there were two schools: the radical, who promoted violent struggle. At the same time, there were moderates who wrote petitions. And obviously, the moderates were well tolerated as a steam while type of thing. On the other hand, the more violent people were arrested and were sent out of the country for 10 to 14 years. And so they paid a heavy price for their agitation. At the same time, the Bengalis were actually threw some bombs on the local British administrators. And so the violence was initially on a small scale, but there was definitely brooding in the early 20th century. Okay, there were varieties of strikes, and primarily due to and protest against the police and army and administration. So that the pot was brewing, to put it mildly. Okay, moving on to the more medical frontiers, the one person who is well known in India, and at least in the medical establishment, was a Russian Jew who was trained in European sciences and worked for the British government, and came to Bombay and developed. Now, this was the era of bacteriology and microbiology, and with the great Pasteur a few years ago, and the German science was in coming to the forefront, was outshining British, and Americans were Johnny-come-lately in that front. And so he worked on microbiology, and the big diseases were plague and tuberculosis. A plague was treatable with vaccines, and at the same time, cholera was endemic in subcontinent. So, Dr. Valdemar Haffkine came to India and worked on developing vaccine. So much so that he was dedicated enough that he tested the vaccine on his own body. Okay, and he was well respected, and it was quoted: "A Russian Jew trained in the schools of European science saves the lives of helpless Hindus and Mohammedans, and is decorated by the descendants of William the Conqueror and Alfred the Great." So obviously, he was rightly, for whatever reasons, he was not recognized with Nobel Prize. Okay, and then, and at the same time, the more new viceroy named Lord Curzon, who had a higher opinion for himself than he perhaps merited, decided to divide the province of Bengal. That did not go well, because just by sheer accident, the eastern half was more Muslim, the western half was more Hindu. So it was, and perhaps Curzon's planning was well-intentioned, because the province was rather large and difficult to govern, but the local educated establishment saw as dividing Hindus and Muslims, and that was a strong agitation that took place, and again fired up a lot of Indian nationalists, including a highly educated ICS officer named Aurobindo Ghosh, and the moment actually, and the partition had to be squashed. And the Ghosh later on turned more mystic and was and philosophical bent, and was employed by the local princes as well. Okay, and there were varieties of attacks that were calling out. Now remember, this was before the First World War. Now on the other side, an educated a Banya, or a trader class, had gone to Britain, as the practice was, and become a barrister, and came back to India and tried to establish practice in Bombay, and that's Mumbai nowadays, and was not too successful. And there was a huge Indian diaspora in South Africa, and he was given a job to represent the Indian Muslim community in lawsuits that were going on against the government. And I went there to work for a few years, and by that time, the apartheid was always there in Africa, and the Indian community numbers were increasing. So to reduce the number, a taxation of substantially heavy in pounds was imposed upon the Indians, the population, and Gandhi took up the cause of the Indian diaspora and started writing letters to the administrator, creating a nonviolent movement, and obviously succeeded beyond his expectations. And he stayed, instead of a couple of years where he had signed up for, ended up staying for almost 20 years. And his success was widely reported in India, and became a hero before he even returned to India, and returned and quickly almost managed to outshine all the traditional leaders of the Indian National Congress. And he realized that this Congress movement was restricted to the educated classes, and without involvement of the masses, this was never going to succeed. So he decided to change the whole agitation movement, and decided to pick the target that would appeal to the masses, including taxation on indigo and later on salt. And so he picked causes with which locals could identify, the uneducated villagers could identify, and started the whole nonviolent protest, which was new in the history of occupied land. And at the same time, he had his approach was different. That we wanted privileges from and rights from Britain. We should also help them in their time of need. So even in Africa, while he worked as a volunteer in the Boer War, and during the First World War also, he was in favor of continued support to the British Empire, and while they were fighting enemies. So it was a complex man in more ways than one. Now, by this time, that there was a small but a vocal diaspora in the United States and Canada, and had realized that India was under foreign occupation, and had formed a rebellion party called Ghadar Party in Arabic, means rebellion. And this was based in USA and Canada primarily. There were a huge number of Sikhs who had settled in the farming community of California. California migration was at that time open, and there were no racial quotas that were instituted. And similarly, in Canada, being a British colony or empire, part of Commonwealth, the Sikhs had settled on the West Coast and had become second or third generation. And then they took up political terrorism. But by this time, they were also influenced by the communist viewpoint that was prevalent around the world and was popular. And ugly incidents took place when the Sikhs hired a ship and tried to land in Vancouver, Canada, because they were told that if you are a British citizen, you could settle anywhere in the empire. But alas, they found out the hard way that the colony was open only to the white citizens, and the ship was turned back, and to put salt on the wound. When they came back, they were arrested when they came back to Calcutta. And by this time, the U.S. Supreme Court had sided with the white majority, and a very enterprising man who, based on the science of anthropology, had tried to prove himself as Caucasian, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court, even though they believed in the Caucasian origin theory of humans and recognized Indians as Caucasians as opposed to Africans and Mongoloids, rejected his. And even though he was granted citizenship, worked honorably in the First World War, his citizenship was revoked. So, and later on, various quotas were set, and the doors were shut for migration for brown and black people. Now, and we talked about George Curzon, who was a brilliant but arrogant person, and again, and then after his foray into partition of Bengal, he went back to Britain and went on to become a very respected politician and served in various capacities in the British establishment. Okay, and was involved in the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, so leading to the creation of modern countries of Jordan and Egypt was continued under British rule. So the whole dismembering of Ottoman Empire, he and the other who is who of the British government were participant, but the creation of all these new countries that are fighting with each other and with the Jews in the Middle East. So it was instrumental in part of that. Okay, and again, during the First World War, the Indian soldiers were recruited. They were not equipped for the weather, were not well supplied, and they served the empire, and at the same time, those who were wounded were taken to hospitals in Britain. But at the same time, when they were attended by white nurses, there was a horror of horrors, and the locals who were had different ideas about race, who protested vehemently, but at the same time, to give the emperor, the king himself was actually visited the hospitals and thanked the soldiers for serving the British war effort. Now, at the end of the war, this is not part of the class, but 1999, the peace conference was held, and at the time, varieties of other nations appealed for independence and self-rule, but lo and behold, India was represented by a Maharaja who sided with the British, and a Lord Singha, who was again a big Anglophile barrister, and they had no interest in asking for Indian independence or self-rule, and they just towed the line that the Brits presented. So one can say India was very underrepresented or poorly represented. And at the same time, there was a big push by Woodrow Wilson for self-determination of a people of the world at the same time. But this again primarily applied to the white population or European nations, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. Okay, but they were rather lukewarm to get supported to the brown and different people who look different. Okay, primarily because Wilson did not want to make too strong a push for it, because the United States had colonies of Philippines, and there was a big factor that would have come up. So they were allowed the Brits to get away with whatever their plans were for the empire, and so the subject never really came up. Now, at the same time, on a small scale, protests were taking up when the Indians served in Singapore, and in the middle of the war, there were Bengalis and who were collaborating with Germans and some Muslims. So there was a big protest movement that took place in Singapore colonies, but that was relatively poorly executed, and then and their rebellion was quickly squashed, and the people who were the leaders were shot. But that just was one of the attempts, that took place. More incidents happened more at home, more close to home. That after the end of the war, the British Empire had fear that the Russian influence and the agitation that had spread, and obviously the protest movement was in full swing, primarily due to the soldiers and the local leaders who were becoming more and more restless. And again, the soldiers who had seen that the other people, such as Muslims, were able to gain their own rights and were able to self-determination. So they saw how backward and under control of Britain India was. And so the agitation was involving the masses, and the soldiers were turning. Now, these soldiers were well armed. They had seen conditions in Europe, and the idea of the flame of self-determination was very much on their forefront. So one of the British officers, Reginald Dwyer, he was Indian-born, and there were non-violent leaders. One Hindu and Muslim were going to speak, and he decided to teach them a lesson. And obviously, as it quite happens, there were some attacks on local Brits, and in order to squash the protest movement, he went in with a Gurkha battalion of 50 soldiers, and they fired as many as 2,000 rounds on people who are unarmed and were in a small walled garden. Okay, and not only that, he directed the fire himself, and decided to and told the soldiers to fire more where people were heading towards the wall. And after this, he made the people who had survived crawl and lick the blood, and humiliated them to many extent. And so I decided to take a revenge. Okay, and his idea was that the battlefield of the France and the city in Punjab, which was Amritsar, was exactly the same, and he had no regrets about his actions. And when the news spread, gradually was squashed, and when the news spread all over the world, including in Britain, people, the British fairness was shaken to the core, and the Amritsar massacre became a big fracture that took place and continued. And at this time, the educated Indians decided there is no way we can survive and get any rights under this type of mentality of the British military and administration. So they decided to change the approach and not just settle for writing quiet petitions and even settling for Dominion status, decided to expand the agitation and the protest movement and for full independence. Obviously, it will take them several years, perhaps due to some miscues and leadership, which was getting more and more concentrated into one hand of Mohandas Gandhi, and that changed, because his word had and there was some he was a mercurial character, to put it mildly, and for whatever reasons decided to stop the agitation in 1919, and because a skirmish took place in a small police compound, and decided that he had made a big mistake and suspended the agitation, and history might have been totally different. And this agitation had effect on even the most celebrated and well-known Indian writer, who was the poet and was the first non-Europeans to get a Nobel Prize as early as 1913, and was well versed and traveled as and was almost like a rock star of that era. And he traveled to the United States, did his poetry readings, which were heavily attended, traveled to Russia and to Japan, and gradually established an ashram in Bengal. And again, he was not exactly an ardent Gandhi supporter, but at the same time, he was a humanist, universalist, internationalist, and a strong anti-nationalist. And the Amritsar massacre plays large in Punjab and all over India. And even when Queen Elizabeth visited, this is her laying a wreath at the site at the same time. And so there were a huge number of more conservative members of the British society actually took up a purse to hand to the savior of the empire. But at the same time, there were more humane people who realized that this was going too far. Now, the agitation that was carried out, was a very slow pace of reform that the government of India offered a few carrots here and there, and the local administration, the elections were held, but the franchise was restricted to the rich and the upper class, who were naturally likely to favor the Brits, and at the same time, a whole total genre of the local princes, they favored federation and wanted to continue ruling in whatever manner that they were, and the British government played it a very smart way for encouraging not so subtle agitation and separation ideology in Muslims and depressed classes, and so a lot of talk and meetings were held, but no real reform was taking place. There was a small bits and pieces were given. At the same time, to digress, just by pure accident, the railway was being expanded, and while looking for bricks for the railways, a whole new civilization, which was almost contemporary of Mesopotamian civilization, was discovered in the Indus Valley in a place called Harappa, and later on Lothal and other areas. And it can be dated back to 3000 before the current era, and it lasted for almost 1,000 plus years, and may have been contemporary along with Egypt. And this was a civilization that the excavation and the archaeological studies were carried out by the British archaeologists with the help of some Indian colleagues, and the work is still going on. Unfortunately, the script of the Indus Valley cannot be deciphered yet. There has been no Rosetta Stone, so that still remains an enigma. But interestingly, the civilization was well developed. They had drainage, bath, and there's no sign of a big warfare that was going on. And so so initially there were a variety of doubts as to how this civilization totally disappeared. And eventually it is possible that a climate change may have played a role. In the Indian epics, Vedas, there were extra rivers, 7 rivers were proposed, and initially only 5 rivers were identified. But when the satellite started going up and taking pictures, the other river dried up riverbed became apparent. So science did prove that there was actually indeed a river called Saraswati that was there, and the drying up and lack of water may have played a big role in the harassment. And obviously, some people may have moved further south or dispersed in the subcontinent as well. Okay, so we talked about the Indus River in the script. Okay, now at the same time, the conservative establishment that was in power was raged against, Gandhi's agitation, and when he was given spokesperson or a lead, he was recognized as a leader. The conservative establishment, led by Churchill, who was sometime in opposition, was agitated strongly, and it was strongly anti-Indian, and he continued his thread throughout his career. And at the same time, he plays a large role in not doing all that they could during the famines in the Second World War. And again, this has been well studied by a Bengali economist, Amartya Sen, by the imperial policy. More than 3 million people starved. And while the British officials begged Churchill to direct food supplies, it was just strongly denied. Okay, and he was contemptuous of India, and always denigrated, saying that the Indians bred like rabbits. Okay, and so that was really a dark stain, which is less well known in Churchill's history as a savior of the empire. Okay, and this was again, he wrote, Gandhi was very savvy politician, was a good match. Okay, and simple, the prime minister, he wrote a letter to Churchill. You reported to have a desire that the simple fakir, as you described, I've long been trying to be a fakir that is naked. It's a more difficult task. So he had a weird but very dry sense of humor. Okay, and this expression is a compliment, though unintended. I appreciate that in touch you trust me for the sake of your people and mine through the word. So this was a book written by Churchill. This, okay, and again, the varieties of roundtable conferences just was carried out. And this is a video which I don't think I'm going to play for the sake of time. But again, varieties of big speeches were given, and they pointed out that a lot of other minorities had some rights as well. And perhaps there was some kernel of truth to that. But the big principle was behind that was to divide and create a fracture amongst population that was trying to present a unified front. Because the Muslims, as I mentioned earlier, were the Johnny-come-lately, and only a small minority were involved in the Indian National Congress. Okay, and then we talked about the Aurobindo Ghosh, who was actually became a mystic and was ably assisted by some European women, and did a lot of spiritual work by living in the French Indian colonies in Pondicherry, and although he supported the Indian independence, he was kind of withdrew himself and became more of a mystic and religious bent, and with self-enlightenment, and translated various Indian religious books, and wrote varieties of learned commentaries on it. He was nominated for Nobel Prize in '43 and Peace Prize, but nothing came out of it because it is a lot of it is voting in popularity contest. At the same time, nod must be given to varieties of Indian scientists who made a small but definite impact in science, including Bose, who was worked in physics, and there were 2 Boses, by the way, and one who's a physicist, was actually collaborated with Albert Einstein, and he is well recognized with the in particle physics, which is called bosons, and the first Indian to win a Nobel Prize for so-called Raman effect, which has to do with light scattering. He would receive Nobel Prize for science for the science of light dispersal in as early as 1932. He came back to India and was the grandfather of Indian research in Bangalore, and were an unusual character named Ramanujan, who was either inspired and self-taught mathematicians who wrote solved various complex pure mathematics problems, and wrote letters to the who is who of Dean of Mathematics at Cambridge named Hardy, and Hardy recognized this barely bare graduate of Madras University named Ramanujan's talent and invited him to study. But this was unfortunately during the First World War, and he could not tolerate the climate and had tuberculosis and died early. And his books are still studied with great enthusiasm for some of his complex contribution in number 3 and pure mathematics, Ramanujan, and a movie was made into his name. Now, at the same time, Delhi was remade. Primary interest was in showing the pomp and glory of the empire, but was redesigned by a British architect named Edward Lutyens, and the whole city of New Delhi was built along with a huge Viceroy Palace, okay, which occupies almost 4.5 acres, takes 600 servants to run, and 400 gardens. Okay, and so obviously this was paid by Indian taxpayers at length. Now, at the same time, the racial attitude was not just a monopoly of the Brit, but a woman who was a writer and social worker in United States, Catherine Mayo, traveled to India for a short duration and saw the poverty and child marriage and other traditions that were there, and wrote a very derogatory book about in India titled Mother India, and strongly supported a pro-colonial rule that, and again, she was anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-Filipino, so represent all the worst things that were there in the United States. And again, Gandhi did a very nice review of it. It's cleverly and powerfully written, and gives the false appearance of truth, lives that it is the report of a drain inspector sent out with one purpose of opening the drains of the country, and to graphic description of the stench. And if Miss Mayo had in fact come to India with open out and to examine trade, there would perhaps be little to complain about. She declares it abominable and patently wrong conclusion with a certain amount of triumph. The drains are India. So again, so there was a very nice review that Gandhi saw through her writings and told it for what it was worth. Now, at the same time, two lawyers, played a big role. We already talked about Mahatma or Mohandas K. Gandhi, but the other side, were other Muslim agitators, who were and members of the Legislative Council, and he were asking for the abolition of the protectorate, and they were part, but this time they were part of the Caliphate movement, which was religious revival after the dissolution, after dissolving the empire. And the Caliphate movement had affected the whole Muslim regions from Egypt all the way to Malaysia and the whole of Arabia. Okay, and a guy named Salgul and other members, were deported to Malta. This was in Egypt, by the way, and then again, so protests were there all over the Middle East and East. Okay, were being carried out. Okay, and Gandhi initially supported this Caliphate movement, trying to say that this was a legit cause for the Muslim religion, and he was trying to play a balanced role, we already talked about Lord Singha, who was a barrister and worked sided with British most of the times, and again represented India. And he opposed the idea of non-cooperation, okay, and because he was a loyalist, just said he was the first Indian member of the British House of Lords and was instrumental in passing the Government of India Act, okay. And this, again, we already talked about the Dominion status was looked down upon by Woodrow Wilson. And sorry, you can't read this slide very well, but it talks about the Khilafat movement, which came to an end when lots of Indians were put in jail, and the leaders, in spite of their best effort, could not maintain unity. And this was caused by a death blow to Khilafat movement, and was the and and again, there were some violent mobs that took place in India, and so Gandhi decided to suspend the agitation entirely and almost went into meditation mode for almost 7 or 8 years, and only took up another cause in 1930 of the Salt Mart, which was well memorized in the movie Gandhi. Okay, sorry about the side. Okay, and we already talked about the 1919 to 1940. So by the time 1940 came about, Franklin Roosevelt's attitude was totally different. India should be made a member of Commonwealth after certain years, and she should be able to choose whatever she wants to do. So the thinking in the United States had changed substantially from 1919, when it was racist and xenophobic, to Roosevelt, who was a lot more open to the rights of all people to determine their own fate. Okay. And the Chamber of Princes was again established in 1920, and they were just looking out for themselves more or less. And there was an advisory council, and lots of princes, primarily were interested in keeping their own privileges. Okay, but there was again a force to be reckoned with, because they controlled at least 1/3 of the whole Indian subcontinent with the crazy system that they had initiated. Okay, and they were a law unto themselves, and they wanted to, and as finally as years dragged on, they wanted to be independent of India, and so India would have been very balkanized if that would have come to. But that's an interesting story, which we'll get to in a few minutes. And obviously, the princes had their own supporter in the British Tory establishment, and the people who were three people who were involved with, obviously, Gandhi, who was getting older by that time, and Nehru, who was his heir apparent, and a Muslim lawyer who was initially not was wanted to stay above and work with the Congress, but realized that this idea was of non-cooperation wasn't getting anywhere. The Muslims were getting a second-class treatment, so he took up the idea of Pakistan as independent. He realized that he could be the top man in that, and that was the rise of the whole idea of a separate rule for the Muslim majority states in India. Okay, and so he was tried to, and he obviously tried to entice as many Indian Maharajas and princes on their side. Okay, and in the how they collaborated during Second World War had a huge impact on the division of India as it took place. Okay, and the princes, were obviously loved to live in a luxurious lifestyle and gathered together, and they were, wasting whenever they traveled to Europe, they wasted their wealth, and they were polygamy was common. Some of them were pedophiles, and they were vain, petty, jealous, cruel, and they were tolerated because of the loyalty of their subjects, and they became a counterweight to the popular movement. Okay, and they were a cash cow for hunters. There were a few good administrators, so. And at the same time, they did not support the Indian independence movement or the Indian National Congress. In fact, when Nehru visited a small state, he was arrested and was kept in jail for a few months and was told not to return. Okay. And hopefully this will pay,
Mystery Man of India. Our first glimpse as the Rajputana came alongside of Marseille. There's the woman of whom you've probably all read, but never seen in a picture. This Madeline Slade, the English daughter of an admiral, who now prefers to be known as Malara Ben. She's one of Mr. Gandhi's most devout disciples. She's leading the way ashore now, and just behind her comes Mr. Gandhi, dressed as he said he would be, just his loincloth, even in the chilly climes of Europe. He's carrying with him his pots and pans, which he declared at the customs. He was trotted around Marseille to several receptions and made one or two speeches which rather frightened the French authorities. When asked to speak into the soundful microphone, he said, "I think not."
Okay.
So we go on our way to England.
So this is one of those, this is a typical British announcement, time to make fun of him rather than, but interestingly, when he traveled to the working class area of Lancashire, he was quite popular and was almost mobbed by, and again, this was, and Churchill always claimed that there actually was no India type of thing, and India was more of a geographical term than United Nations, than equator. So it is alarming to see, nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious inner temple lawyer, posing as a fakir striding naked to the steps of the Viceregal channel. So it was a quite racist and opinionated view. Okay, and again, Churchill definitely encouraged and supported the separation of India to Pakistan, and primarily because the Muslims supported Britain during the Second World War. Okay, and now mobilization during Second World War type of thing that took place, and in some of the peasant movements, were carried out by Gandhi, and they worked, developed simultaneously side by side the middle class mobilization. So finally, the uh, uh, demand for independence and protest were reaching the masses. Okay, and there were varieties of state conferences were held with a left-leaning Congress, and major struggle broke out in various areas of India, all over the major states. And the princes actually were tried to suppress them ruthlessly, and some of them tried to stem the tide of popular revolt by inflaming communal passions. Okay, and so there was, when the country was up in arms to in many ways, Okay, and Keep of India, the Conservative Party basically had a different attitude towards it. Okay, and so this was, the whole time was in turmoil, just to summarize, but mildly. Okay, and ingratitude of Indians. So you can see how, Churchill's ideology was, to maintain the empire at all cost. Now, in spite of the proposal by Congress not to participate or cooperate with Britain in the Second World War, because primarily they insisted that independence should be guaranteed, which Britain was not prepared to do so. And so they decided, resigned from their ministry. A lot of them spent the whole several years of during the Second World War in jail, although small-scale agitations by some of the smaller members continued, and there was the Britain suppressed it rather ruthlessly. In spite of that, the huge number of Indian volunteered in Britain, and you can see from the numbers, that India sent as many as 23,000 died, 1.7 million people joined the war effort and served in Malaya, in Singapore, in Burma, and in Middle East, and to Europe to a lesser extent. And this was incurred a huge debt. And India gave, Indian government gave a huge loan to Britain. And even initially, when the war ended, Britain owned India a large amount of debt. And this again became a bone of contention between the two areas, two nations that formed. and by this time, the game was up. Britain was running out of manpower, and they just did not have the desire or the capacity to control the agitation in the subcontinent. Okay, and then again, we talked about this famines earlier, and the similar famine in 1877, when a larger famine took place in 1842, and is it evidenced by the famines that took place and killed a large number of population. Here are some of the numbers. And this way, by this time, Americans were stationed in Calcutta and tried to supply China. And at the same time, a small but very motivated regiment was formed called the Indian National Congress by an Indian leader, and the people who were captured and liberated by the Japanese in Malaya and Singapore, and they were armed formed the armed resistance of Indian National Army, and they marched along with the Japanese through Burma and through the jungles. But by this time, the Japanese supply lines were stretching further and further, and they were unable to match the firepower of Calcutta, and the weather and the terrain was difficult to fight, and so they were not able to actually enter out the way to Calcutta, but they were right at the border in present-day Assam, which is the easternmost part of India, bordering Burma. And at the same time, there were varieties of local satyagraha movement were carried out in various parts of India, and Gandhi was, again, his usual way of going on fast. And by this time, and that one of those agitations was not too successful because of the tacit support by the viceroy at that time. Now, the British government decided to keep sending various cabinet missions, and who did not have enough authority to negotiate for independence. And again, the varieties of conferences and the commissions that were sent were opposed by the locals until they promised full independence. And so that never really came to any big conclusion, because they were offering him peanuts or carrots, so to speak, without the real this thing. And they were trying to mediate two sides which were falling further and further apart. And so the negotiation continued without any real definite outcome. And again, the varieties of plans were proposed by various commissions, and the military generals, were getting fed up because they were not getting anywhere. And by the time, the message that they were receiving from London were totally opposite of what they wanted to do. Okay, and they were trying to divide the three fractions of the princes, the Muslims, and the Hindu majority. Okay, and primarily, they were trying to control some areas which are rich in natural resources. For example, one southern kingdom which had natural reserves of thorium. Okay, and so this was, becoming a big boiling pot. And these are some of the more details, perhaps more than you'd plan to. So varieties of plants, and by this time, Britain wanted to get out of it. The election had turned to the Labour government, and their big plans were to get out sooner rather than later, before real military uprising took place. And because after in the Second World War, a naval mutiny did take place in Bombay, and by the sailors who were not only protesting for independence and self-rule, but were also fed up with the second-class treatment by their officers. Okay, and a viceroy was appointed who was connected to the royal family, and that is none other than Lord Louis Mountbatten. And he was came in, and he was sympathetic and friendly with the Indian who is who, primarily Nehru, and at the same time, and he did not like or respect the stubbornness of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Mountbatten's wife, Lady Mountbatten, was quite friendly with Nehru, as you can see in this picture, because and Nehru by that time was widower, and so between the two of them, they were able to form a plan of independence. And finally, when they realized that Jinnah was going to be stubborn and not going to accept any type of federation, it was decided to accept the partition. And now the big problem that Indian leaders were left with was the princely states who wanted to go on their own way, and it was left to some savvy Indian politicians to appeal to their vanity, sense of nationality, and they use all sorts of men with masterful of diplomacy to eventually succeed all of them to give up their states and estates and join either one or the other big areas, i.e. India or Pakistan. And the partition lines were drawn by a British administrator who had never actually been to the country, and within 6 weeks tried to divide based on population estimates, divide the two continents. I'm sorry, escape. Now I can advance my slide.
The scene is Northolt Airfield. The occasion, the departure of Lord Mountbatten of Burma, who was leaving for India with his wife. Before the new viceroy,
Okay, now
there lay the task of holding office for the brief but obviously difficult period of just over a year until the date when Indians are to take full control of India. Everyone in Britain, I'm certain, wishes the viceroy all possible success in India.
I was in school, and they said, you'll miss the last term of school, and we're taking you out in the middle of this term because Dad has been appointed Viceroy of India, and so we're going out for probably a couple of years, and
Okay.
probably take you as well, so it would be useful.
In March 1947, Mountbatten arrived in India. The former Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia had a reputation for being a decisive leader, a man who could knock heads together. His brief was simple: to get a deal and get Britain out before India imploded.
The swearing in, of course, was a very great ceremony in the Durbar Hall, and so trumpeters and all the staff in their full dress uniform, my father in full dress uniform, my mother in a long white dress, and I think a sort of laurel wreaths in her hair. And they looked like film stars.
The Viceroy, his wife Edwina the Vicereine, and their daughter Pamela moved into Viceroy's house in New Britain.
So I think, just for sake of time, I'm not going to play this because it just tells about the so-called last days of the empire. And there were varieties of orders titles were given out as usual. And eventually, now at the same time, there was a small but definite fragment in Britain that wanted to, that was speaking for the princes and were really siding with the princes to balkanize the subcontinent. Now, when Britain decided to leave, there were huge mutiny took place in the Royal Navy, as I talked about earlier. The flashpoint went to various seaports in India, which involved 10,000 soldiers, and then again, and so that really scared the British establishment. And then finally, the partition was decided based on ethnic lines of the Muslim Northwest province, and Punjab was bisected, so was Bengal. And initially they were asking for a corridor across from north to south, but then wiser heads prevailed, and two different East and West Pakistan were created, not united, and in between was India, and the perilous problem of Kashmir, which had Hindu Maharaja and Muslim majority population was left. Okay, and the Maharaja was indecisive, wanted to be independence until he was attacked by the Afghan Pathans. And when he was under trouble, he signed the instrument of accession with India, and the Indian army flew in and was able to expel the irregular soldiers who migrated from the Northwest province, primarily Pathans. Okay, and that is, and unfortunately, Nehru was big believer in United Nations, and the plebiscite was promised as long as Pakistan and India went back to the borders, and that plebiscite has never taken place after 70 odd years. Okay, and initially people in the West had doubts that given the enormity of the task, that India has little chance of remaining intact and would break up in a variety of states, with each state its own language and culture. But that has proven wrong. They have been able to hold peaceful elections and democracy. They have not had to revise the constitution. There has been no coup. But at the same time, the administration, the socialistic trend that was practiced by Nehru did not work very well. And while both India and Korea were on the same level in 1950, Korea has progressed dramatically, and the Indian literary and the life expectancy has progressed much more slowly than they could have. And Nehru was, a socialist, or and had communist sympathies, and always that did not go with the United States, which had the attitude of either are with us, against us, and did not participate in the and took sides in the Cold War, and that just did not go very well. And in the United States, due to having listening ears in Pakistan, always favored Pakistan, and they finally, after Nehru's death, things changed, and it took a long time. Okay, and again, sorry about the slide, which I should have changed it. And some princes wanted independence, but eventually, due to some clever diplomacy of Machiavellian stage by the Indian administrators, that did not turn out to be the case. Okay, and this is some sites about modern India that has actually slowly but steadily thrived and made her impact on the world stage. Okay, and again, there were other minorities on the Pakistan borders who were Afghan ancestry, and one of them was actually a Gandhian nonviolent person, and they wanted self-determination, of a lesser-known figure, and he was a Pacific Muslim, if you can believe that, and he opposed the partition, but wanted a few area for Pashtuns, who were ethnically Afghans, but he was. But was never paid attention to, and unfortunately he died with a broken heart and was paid price by being arrested by Pakistani authorities. And so the integration was carried out, which was a great achievement of the newly formed Indian Republic. Okay, and so this was okay. We talked about it, and then finally I think we're coming to the end of the talk, and I think I had a slide for the Indian independence movement. Okay, and we already talked at length about the princes. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell too long on it. Okay, and okay, and these are some other fun videos, but sake of time, I think I'm going to gradually wind down. Okay, and the varieties of British influence continues in P.G. Wodehouse is still very popular in India because Indians appreciate the humor that was made of the upper class. Okay, and at the same time, Indian diaspora has spread wide in the former British Empire, Eastern South Africa, Fiji, West Indies, Suriname, Malaya, Mauritius, you name it. Okay, and the person of Indian origin have spread all around the world and have become second or third generation And primarily sports has become the big uniting factor between Britain and India. Varieties of works in Indian literature has made impact in writing in English language. These are some of the works that are well known in the movies as well as in literature. They've made an impact and is read as a nostalgic view on the empire. And at the same time, with the British population, substantial number still thinks that it had a positive impact and they're proud of their empire. But the time will tell as to what the eventual impact was. And the empire and the movies, are well known to made by Hollywood. And the writers, the Salman Rushdie, the most recent one, Muluk Roy Janan, one of the earlier ones. Okay. And even in different disciplines such as architect. And here was the former prime minister playing cricket when traveling to India. That is none other than the infant terrible Boris Johnson. Okay, and this is the British Commonwealth, which is kind of a debating body, but does not have a whole lot of impact in the polarized or three-partition world of the modern times. Okay, and including the huge Indian presence, we can evidence by a big temple of Hindu temple in the suburban London. And the Indian nurses and the physicians supply a huge amount of British National Health Service. Okay, and again, and currently Modi has, and last but not the least, an Asian Indian who studied in India as well as United States, won the Nobel Prize for his research in biology at Cambridge University and was the president of the most prestigious Royal Society of, which was probably the first brown-skinned person to head such an austere body. And this was, the brief view of the Indian national anthem, which is well known and to obviously to the Indians, but I'm not going to play it for sake of time. Okay, we'll stop share at this time and I will end the dictation.